He didn't ask for my story. He asked if I could walk, simple as water. The question cut through pride, excuses, and the old habit of decorative pain. I nodded, though my ankles doubted me, and he waited without doubt of his own. The wind pressed heat against us. A bit of gravel jumped like a skittish lizard, listening. He introduced himself like a fact that didn't need witnesses. Taza, he said, and nothing else. No titles, no borrowed names, no story trying to buy my attention with noise. He studied my wrists, then my gait, then the way I guarded my ribs. "Don't breathe deep yet," he murmured, hearing pain I had not learned to hide again. From a small pouch he pulled a twist of leaves and a little horn spoon. The paste smelled like crushed juniper and wind after rain, earthy and sure. He spread it along the rope burns with fingers that read skin like a map. Cooling traveled under heat, a narrow river finding an old, thirsty channel, promising patience. A metal clink drifted the arroyo, thin as a rumor but sharp as a blade. He tilted his head, reading distance, then set the salve just inside my reach. I understood the lesson. Help shouldn't become a leash, and dignity prefers arm's length. We moved to the cut bank, slow and folded, letting shade practice its small bravery. He watched my feet test rock, then watched my breath manage its new job. "Water first," he said, as if the word contained an oath and a compass. I fumbled for the water skin. He steadied it without touching my hands. Vulnerability sat next to resilience and agreed, for once, to share the bench quietly. Far off, a horse blew, then snorted, then went quiet behind deliberate reins. He scanned the rim and the arroyo mouth, then returned to the puzzle of me. "Walk easy," he said, "and count your steps until they behave like truth." Counting steadied the pulse. Step 3 decided to believe in step 4, which helped. I told him a sliver, because slivers matter when you are stitching through dusk. "My uncle wants my deed," I said. "My father's letter is missing or stolen." The word letter cracked the heat and let memory breathe into the room. Its paper felt present against my ribs, even though it wasn't there yet. Taza nodded in the quiet way men nod when judgment would slow the work. "Letters hold stubborn kinds of truth," he said, "sometimes stronger than men with clocks." He wrapped a strip of cloth around my splinted wrist, measuring tension with patience. Then he tied a knot that lay flat and sure. "Promises should hold," he said. Hoofbeats flickered somewhere above, counting their own arrogance on the stone. He glanced upward once, then settled the knot with a last precise press. The cord didn't bite. It respected weight and weather like a seasoned beam. I felt the impulse to apologize to someone nameless, then let the impulse pass. "We go to water," he said, drawing a line in dust with his boot. "Cottonwoods," I answered, hearing the grateful hush of leaves before they were close. He motioned for me to lead, then slipped one pace ahead to take the wind. Survival mood prefers small courtesies that look like air moving the right direction. Heat pooled and broke. The arroyo's mouth drew us into scrub that hummed. We walked in a rhythm shaped by terrain, not pride or the eyes of men. Taza's silence didn't crush. It made space where my breath could stand upright. The ground gave gently, as if reconsidering its earlier plan to steal my balance. A laugh traveled the slope, stuck in rock, then thinned like spoiled sugar. We paused under a lip of shade while dust drifted from a careless heel. Taza measured the echo's age with a listen I envied and hoped to learn. He nodded once. Impatience carries faster than hooves, and we could use that. We passed a scatter of mesquite pods and the bones of a jackrabbit's ruin. The sun pressed harder. Memories pressed back. Those rooms that dressed me as furniture. Bruised pasts tried to narrate my steps. I told them to write footnotes, not chapters. Taza didn't look at me, but something in his posture agreed with that boundary. He pointed at a narrow track where stone drank the last rain with caution. "Walk there," he said. "Let the earth remember you gently, not loudly." I followed, letting my shadow tuck tight against scrub and unneeded ideas. The water smell offered a whisper algae, damp clay, and the kindness of shade. He spoke then, not about himself, about my feet. "Don't fight the ground so much. Invite it," he said, "and it gives more than it takes." Most days, I let my knees unlock. The world tilted, then steadied like a good sentence. Quiet transformation is a shy animal. I tried not to scare it with relief. A rain buckle chimed somewhere toward the ridge, then silenced itself like a thief. He stopped and listened with his jaw, eyes soft, but shoulders honest about danger. We crouched behind a prickly pear that had survived more sermons than I have. He tapped my wrist wrap, not to test it, just to remind it to hold. I thought of chrome counters and mirror reflections back in town that lied. I thought of streetlights that made loneliness visible and called it safety. Of penthouse empties that echoed with air-conditioned weather and no human weather. Of the clinic of a second chance, where a ledger waited for names that stayed. I had signed once, then left, afraid staying would break the old spell. Today felt different. Unspoken connection can coax staying into the body without traps. Not love, not legend, only two strangers walking the same math under hot sky. The arithmetic calmed my hands. The rap's knot seemed to agree with the calm. "Tell me where the deed lives," he said, as the shade slowly thickened. "Mission ledger," I said. "Copy of my father's claim if they didn't misplace it." He didn't spit, didn't scoff. He looked at the horizon like a calendar. "Ledgers outlive men who edit themselves for victory," he said, not smiling, not bitter. Wind rose. Dust braided itself into a loose rope and fell apart again. Taza adjusted the strap on his water skin and scanned north and west twice. "Your letter," he said, as if measuring an invisible weight behind my ribs. "When did it go missing?" I weighed words carefully. "Confessions can open old doors. When I refused my uncle's prayer," I said. "He prefers God on deeds. Men like that need witnesses more than gods," Taza answered, almost to the air. We stepped over a washed gully, careful not to break the crust too loudly. The air cooled 1 degree. Cottonwood scent became a sentence with verbs. He slowed, then pointed to a small track no animal would boast about. "Riders cut here," he said. "They hurry when they leave and swagger returning." He described it without judgment, as if tracks were grammar and we were editors. I heard forgiveness underneath, the kind that does not excuse, only declines to rot. We reached an overhang that held a sleeve of shade just wide enough. He guided me under, then stood outside it, taking sun like a deliberate choice. "Rest your back," he said. "Tell your breath it has permission to be large." I obeyed, and emotional intimacy walked in without looking anyone in the eye. A tin laugh repeated across stone. Closer, the cadence a little too confident. We waited it out. Pride likes audience, and we were not selling tickets. Taza tugged his knife free, not to wave it just so it could think. I checked the wrap again. The knot sat there, modest and unafraid of work. He taught me a hand sign then, 2 fingers, 2 beats, and a point. Stop, listen, move. The sign fit my bones like a habit I wanted. I mirrored it once. His mouth almost softened, then remembered the ridge. Hidden pain tugged at me, wanting to be honored with a speech. I refused. We left the overhang, angling toward a wash where willow hid its thirst. The sand cooled through my boots. Shade stitched a loose seam across our path. Cottonwood leaves whispered the same rumor over and over to restless air. I quickened without thinking. He slowed me with a palm that asked respect of pace. "Water doesn't forgive rush," he said, settling into steps with kinder edges. "We arrive together, or we arrive wrong." The rule sounded older than both of us. I nodded. The rush stepped back, muttering about the size of its shadow. Personal growth rolled its shoulders and started earning its keep with quieter breath. We broke into a narrow pocket where green gathered itself into grace. A low pool reflected leaves and sky like a mirror that remembered kindness. He let me kneel first. Water is a test some men insist on owning. I cupped a small drink, then another, anchoring the day to a clean ritual. He refilled the skin, then rinsed the horn spoon and set it in sundae. We ate 2 mouthfuls of dry meat that remembered smoke and road dust. I felt the ache in my ribs unclench one stubborn notch, then reconsider. He watched me chew as if patience could season food. It worked a little. Hoofbeats thudded again, heavier now, weight settling into decision rather than search. We rose together, every move considerate of tomorrow's version of this story. Taza looked at the upper bank, then at a wedge of shadow near reeds. "Wait here," he said. "If they were smart, they would cut sign under cottonwoods." "If they were smart," I said, "I wouldn't be standing." My laugh sounded brittle. He accepted the truth of that and scanned the sand with a tracker's mercy. His body spoke competence without announcing itself like a parade through church. Competence shifted something in me. The old loneliness lost a chair it liked. I wanted to pay him, to balance an account before fear imagined a debt. He refused with a shake that respected my instinct and his own boundary. "I'm walking you to shade," he said. "That's not a price. It's a rule. Rules worn by kindness last longer." I filed the lesson near other useful tools. We followed the stream bed, stepping on stone to keep the mud from telling stories. He showed me how to place my heel where his had just been. 2 sets of prints looked like one person willing to learn from the ground. Unspoken connection became a function. Fewer marks, less noise, more hours borrowed. A dragonfly stitched light over water. A frog plopped punctuation under reeds. The day changed sentence structure, moving from threat to grammar with caution. We rounded the bend where cottonwoods thickened into a loose, protective congregation. Leaves flashed silver like coins the wind refused to spend too quickly. "Almost," he said, and the word poured cool into places panic used to live. The pool widened there, shallow and clear, with bank sand like sifted flour. We stepped into the shade together, bodies learning how to stand without apology. For one small second, quiet transformation touched my shoulder and did not flee. Then I saw it. A fresh horseshoe crescent stamped deep beside the damp. Another print overlapped, then a third, angled as if circling for fun. The sand still held the ridges sharp. Water had not softened any edges. Taza crouched, traced the nearest mark, and lifted dust that hadn't settled yet. His eyes met mine. No panic lived there, only arithmetic and time. "They drank here," he said, and turned back to enjoy what they missed. He pointed to the far bank where brush had bent twice, then recovered. The day inhaled, and my ribs learned how little air a minute can hold. We reached the cottonwoods and saw a fresh sign. 3 riders circling back. "Justice smells like dust," right before men try to sell it to you. A dry sweetness that rides the wind ahead of their boots and promises order with a smile while their spurs carve your name into ground they already priced. And as we slid from the cottonwoods into scrub that loves secrets more than witnesses, I tasted that dust and knew Ephraim's riders had decided to make a market of me before sundown, which meant we had to turn the desert into a ledger that favored truth and keep moving until the ink learned our side of the story. The air quivered with trapped noon. A fly stitched frantic circles above my wrist wrap. A locust rattled the same 4 notes until my ribs learned the rhythm, and beside me Taza read the slope with a patience that did not waste breath on wonder or fear, only on distance. We kept to the darker soil where last week's rain still stored a cooler memory, stepping heel to toe to soften our story. And every 20 strides he glanced up to measure light and drift, then glanced down to measure our own hurricane of signs. And all the while my mind recited old catechisms of abandonment recognition, the lullabies Ephraim used when he was teaching me how to be grateful for silence that served him and suspicious of any sentence that served me, which is how a man baptizes a woman into vanishing without ever wetting her head. A faint metal ping climbed the arroyo, as small as a coin-tapping glass, and we paused behind a greasewood that had learned to survive by looking unimportant, while dust lifted in a thin blue sheet and settled with the resignation of people who know courts by smell. Taza pointed with 2 fingers to the faint ladder of tracks angling across our path, the hind half of a horseshoe biting deeper than the fore, the right side softer than the left, the print already smudging where heat persuades edges to forget. And he told me without talking that we had a watcher with a sore fetlock, impatient and certain enough to circle twice before choosing swagger, and that if we cut north for a 1/4 mile we could step into an old wash where the ground swallows stories whole. A hawk skated the sky. Somewhere a lizard knocked, pebbles loose, and announced itself without shame. From the ridge came a laugh with too much air in it, the laugh of a man who loves a crowd and hasn't noticed the crowd went home. By first gray, the worst had decided we were poor entertainment. Smoke settled like a stubborn uncle who knows when to be quiet. We faced the blackened strip and counted what still breathed correctly. The cottonwood outside our boundary stood alive, leaves holding their coins. "Judge sent for you," Bram said from the lane, hat off, voice smaller. Soot striped his cheek. His badge looked embarrassed about its shine. "Tonight," he added, "after the ash settles, before the town remembers loyalties." He glanced at Taza, not with contempt, with calculative fear bordering on respect. "What changed?" I asked, though I already smelled fresh paper politics. Someone's pastor rehearsed a memory. Someone's banker rehearsed a price, he said. Bram turned, then stopped. "I didn't cut your line," he added, without swagger. He rode off, shoulders carrying a story that won't be generous in the telling. We washed our faces at the pump, the water iron cool and forgiving. It ran black at first, then gray, then a good, honest clear. I saw my mirror reflection in the bucket, tired and ready for sentences. Taza's reflection stood beside mine like punctuation that prefers meaning to vanity. We set the yearlings to graze where the ground knew gratitude. Neighbors left pie tins, water barrels, and a promise to show up again. Hollis shook my hand like a man paying a debt he wanted to owe. Mrs. Kincaid handed me bread and declared it legal for breakfast therapy. The sun climbed, pretending innocence. Ash lifted, pretending snow with secrets. I packed Father's letter inside my vest again, where pulse keeps it warm. I said, and Taza nodded. We would check the true corner after court. He shouldered the shovel, and the tool looked comfortable knowing better work remained. Evening folded the ranch into more manageable shapes. Edges softened, lines honest. A fox ghosted the fence and measured us with respectful disinterest. Quiet. Then took Mission Road like people you can trust. The horses chose the steady gate judge's mistake for guilt and neighbors for grief. Streetlights unspooled ahead. tired halos around windows that pretend to be eyes. May's bell dozed, then woke as we crossed the square toward the door. The courthouse smelled of bleach and opinion. The clerk's pen clicked like a tick. People stared at Taza, at our soot, at the ledger under my arm. We climbed the steps. Boots made that hollow tone buildings believe is worship. Pike waited on the landing with his red string and an almost proud posture. Bram leaned on the rail as if it was the last friend he owned. The door cracked. A bailiff yawned a welcome and hid his curiosity badly. Inside, the bench glowed under lamp oil like an altar that charges rent. The judge looked smaller. The gavel looked smug. The air smelled slightly scorched. A single document lay centered like a dare on a plate too white. Pike's hand hovered near it as if introducing a pet to strangers. May stood at the side with her ledger and a jaw that ends arguments. She met my eyes, then Taza's, then the paper, then back to me. My breath counted 4, then held at the top as a habit. I stepped closer because fear confuses polite with useful, and I was done. On the bench lies a new deed, my name spelled wrong on purpose. Redemption enters rooms like a draft felt before it's seen. The courtroom door breathed once, and cooler air slid past my knees as if the building had decided to remember honesty. The lamp hissed. The red string on Pike's paper flickered. My father's ledger line in Sister May's book refused to blink. Somewhere outside, a horse stamped and shook its bridle, metal tapping a thin alarm under the judge's cough. May stepped forward first, habit starchy, eyes unbothered by men who price vowels. Ledger, she said, and set the mission book where law could find its spine. Pages whispered as she turned to my father's date. The ink had weather in it. Even dust behaved. Beside her, the schoolteacher held onion skin rubbings of the river bend, charcoal tracing each stubborn curl like a hymn. The room tilted toward them the way crops lean toward wind that brings rain. Pike's smile tried to stay, then remembered embarrassment. He kept the new deed close, red string tied like a fuse that loves attention. Ephraim leaned back with a church, man's patience and a gambler's eyes. He wore righteousness like a clean shirt. Bram sat taller than his fear and shorter than his title. The judge pinched his lower lip, a man negotiating payment terms with his conscience. May tapped the line. Date, witness, boundary. The paper hissed again. The lamp popped. A moth thumped once and died on the globe. Secondary record, she said, older than that ribbon, and meant to outlive it. Her voice didn't raise. It didn't need to. The bench's wood seemed to breathe easier. The schoolteacher stepped up, knuckles white around her rubbings. Children learn this bend, she said, laying the translucent sheets over Pike's drawing with quiet precision. The river on onion skin sat where the river sits in winter, not where Ephraim's fence pretended it summered. She held the edges until the judge could see difference, then let go slow. A pew creaked. Someone swallowed too loudly. The wall clock clicked its cheap brass opinion. Clerk, the judge said, and Otis Pike's throat learned thirst in a hurry. He smoothed his hair, then smoothed it again, waiting for a braver version of himself to arrive. You filed a clarification, the judge continued, against a mission ledger and a teacher's map. Silence gathered like laundry before a storm. Outside, hoofbeats passed and did not stop. Pike looked at me, then at Ephraim, then at May, who does not accept stares when work requires eyes. There was pressure, he said, and the word cracked halfway out of his mouth. From where? May asked, courteous as a needle. Agents, Pike breathed. A banker who prefers flexible water. A pastor who enjoys tidy stories. I was told the county likes quiet. He stroked the red string as if it might absolve him if petted. The judge rubbed his temple and found nothing worth keeping there. He looked down at the deed, at the ledger, at the children's river, then at my rope-scarred wrists, which had stopped telling their own story only because other voices finally took a turn. "Mr. Pike," he said, "you will correct the record within 24 hours. You will file a notice of error. You will pay a fine appropriate to the inconvenience, and you will consider the price of quiet when it comes due." He turned to Ephraim. "Mr. Hart, the court reverses the provisional change. The Northfield remains where Stone says it island. Your private sale is cancelled. Sit." Ephraim smiled like a man who has already framed his next mistake. "For the good of the county," he began, but the judge lifted a palm and found steel at last. "For the good of the truth," he said. The gavel touched wood. It didn't pound. It announced itself like a draft under a door that finally fits. Outside, the bell remembered joy and tried a small note. It held. Whispers rose, braided, then fell apart. Some carried my name with respect. Some tried not to. I stood, let breath arrive to the edges, and spoke before gratitude grew shy. "My father taught fences to avoid becoming wounds," I said. "This room did the same today." I turned so the gallery would have to see the person they had practiced misnaming. The line held because we held it. Sister May, the teacher, those who carried buckets last night, and the man who read the canyon when Rope decided to teach me humility. I nodded toward Taza. He stood at the back, half shadow, fully present, hands quiet, attention unarmed. He helped save cattle, fence, and breath, I said, without claiming a thing he didn't earn. Heads turned, old habits creaked, and I felt vulnerability risk daylight. Taza did not move. He let the credits skim off and fall. Dignity over theater. "We built," he said, simple as water. "We keep building." The courthouse swallowed that line and wished it tasted more like gossip. A draft slid under the door again. Paper edges fluttered. The lamp hissed in agreement. Resilience settled its weight across my shoulders without making a scene. Ephraim rose for a last try. "Her companion," he said, sweet as a clean knife, "has been seen on roads where good men prefer not to travel." May's jaw slid a half-inch toward patience. The school teacher looked at Ephraim the way arithmetic looks at superstition. "So have pastors," she said gently. A laugh, quickly strangled, escaped a pew. The judge remembered his job. "Enough," he said. "Names don't earn posture. Work does." He signed the order, blotting carefully so ink did not run, then handed the correction to Bram like a man making an enemy choose honor. Bram took it. His eyes flinched when they found mine. He held that paper like it could burn or baptize and hoped for both. "Serve it," the judge added. The bailiff's boots thumped once, twice, confirming reality for anyone lagging. Outside, the hallway tasted of bleach and sweat and the near end of fear. People broke into smaller truths and drifted toward doors. A child ran his chalk across the baseboard and drew two handles, in case one stuck. Unspoken connection brushed my sleeve. I turned. Taza had come close enough that our shadows recognized each other. He didn't reach for me. Neither did I. I offered my hand, palm up, like a promise and a question. He set his hand in mine, steady, warm, no claim made. Emotional intimacy walked between us and kept its hat on. Boot steps clicked faster toward the entrance. The bell outside stopped pretending to be casual. A horse blew. Leather creaked. The door swung hard against the stopper. Sun carved a diagonal across the floor, bright as a warning. A rider filled the doorway, dust on his shoulders, hat brim low, voice already choosing violence or memory. He looked past the judge, Past May, his mouth shaped a name the county doesn't know, the old one. The trail name a grandmother might have spoken at a river bend before winters changed. At the door, a rider arrives who knows another name. Taza once wore houses inhale the first night they keep you dry. Ours did it at dusk, boards taking a long drink of shade while smoke from the first legal chimney in a month braided itself into the cottonwood. But peace waited its turn. The rider from the courthouse shadowed us to the lane, then halted where my fence asks even neighbors to find patience. He called the old name again, soft, careful, respectful in a dialect that carried miles and winters, not slurs. The sound shook a shelf inside me I didn't know I'd built. Taza stepped forward without borrowing my breath. He loosened his jaw and let his shoulders demonstrate that he was ready for work, not theater. I hear you, he said, using the name back once, then setting it down gently where both men could see it. The rider eased out of the saddle, boots whispering apology to dust, hands open as if bargaining with memory. Debt, he said, not yours alone. I carried someone else's. I brought it where it belongs. Wind moved a little. A grasshopper clicked. My porch step admitted it would creak soon. The rider described a trade on a riverbank. Years back, tools for grain, words for safe passage, and how a different man had left a promise to return an heirloom when the road allowed. The road hadn't allowed. The heirloom had traveled anyway, changed hands until it found his saddlebag. He lifted a small bundle wrapped in soft, old cloth, and the air changed temperature. Taza didn't touch it yet. Who bled for it? He asked. Not challenging. Naming cost because things without price rot quickly. Two men who thought themselves hungrier than they were, the rider said. No graves I'd visit, but gossip got fed. He set the bundle on my porch rail as if placing a child who didn't like loud rooms. I heard your name at the courthouse and knew where to bring this ending. A pause held, taut and kind. Hidden pain prowled, hoping someone would trip. We all refused it. Taza lifted the cloth. Inside lay a small carved piece, simple, precise, made by hands that understood grain and time. It wasn't ceremony. It was competence preserved. He breathed once, full length, as if his ribs had waited years for this exact angle. Belonged to my mother's brother, he said. Left in a hurry when men decided to edit maps with guns. He turned the piece in his palm until light remembered it. No hands reached for weapons, no threats rehearsed themselves. The rider looked 10 years undone and then stitched himself with relief. Debt closed, Taza said. Not on your back alone. He wrapped the carving again and tied the cloth with the same knot that won't slip promises should hold. Come in, I offered, the word too small for the moment and big enough anyway. He shook his head. I'll sleep easier out there, he said, tipping the brim toward the river that keeps both secrets and names with accuracy. He rode away without collecting applause. Silence arrived, but not the lonely kind. The creek traded gossip with stones. Swallows drew cursive above the pasture. The fence accepted evening like a patient body. We sank the last post at the north line together, the one my father marked in the margins, cairn beside bedrock where water refuses to lie for summer. I packed soil with a boot heel. Taza tamped in measured lifts. The post settled as if it had been waiting for this exact day and no other. Ledgers filed, May had said before we left town. Clerk cried a little. I didn't. The school teacher sent home 2 sheets for my wall. The children's river and the right bend enlarged. I pinned them in my kitchen beside Father's letter, whose edges now remembered clean hands and smoke. Letters of truth prefer company. I gave them a corner where morning finds them first. We burned brush in a shallow trench and watched sparks decide against distance. The pot simmered on the trivet stew with last autumn's beans and a righteous onion. We ate at the threshold because we aren't ready for full rooms yet. Bowls warmed our fingers. Conversation warmed everything else. Emotional intimacy perched nearby with its boots off, not asking us to name it. The house listened to us the way good rooms do, with beams that don't interrupt. Streetlight from town lay thin on the horizon, a tired halo that reminded me of chrome diners, mirror reflections, and penthouse empties I'd once mistaken for safety. A child's chalk door on the courthouse baseboard flickered up in memory. I had walked through it today without asking permission. Personal growth does that, arrives without fanfare and changes furniture. The clinic of a second chance would be closing now. Iodine sighing into evening. Somewhere a nurse filed a ledger entry for a birth, a repair, a refusal to believe paperwork over breath. We set tools in their hooks and hung the rope neatly, the knot visible for later hands. Taza checked the tether line twice, not because fear requires it, because care is its own temperature. Your name sits right where it belongs, he said, eyes on the cairn instead of me. Ink, stone. I felt forgiveness for earlier versions of myself, hungry for small approval, suspicious of slow grace. We earned it, I said, and my voice didn't apologize for being loud enough to hear. A fox moved along the fence, reading our day with its nose. The cottonwood we left outside the claim played the same coin-bright song it has always played. 2 sets of prints waited by the seep under the canyon wall. Soft edges from earlier, deeper edges from later. 2 footprints by the waterline staying. I could feel them from here like a second pulse. Unspoken connection made room for sleep without demanding a bed. Do you want the fire inside? I asked. Not yet, he said. Let the house learn us gradually. It made sense. Quiet transformations last longer when you don't force them into the doorway with trumpets. We ladled seconds and ate slower, tasting onion forgiveness and bean resilience. The stew didn't lie. It had worked as hard as we had. Wind pressed the eave once, then twice, testing nails. The boards answered in the language of good joinery, no panic. I remembered the brush fire's roar and felt the opposite move through my ribs. When you heard that old name, I said, not to pry, to promise I would accept more rooms of him. I heard my grandmother counting, he answered, and a creak correcting a map. Neither voice wanted revenge. He looked toward the river, where stars practiced their job without eating anything alive. Debts closed several ways. I liked the one we used. We washed bowls at the pump. Water ran clear and laughed at our soot. My mirror reflection in the tin looked like a person who could keep this up. His reflection beside mine looked like punctuation that turns a sentence true. We didn't kiss. We didn't pose. We stacked the bowls and let love that defies fairy tale tropes do its best work, showing up at dawn and again at dusk, carrying, mending, lifting, listening. The house inhaled again, then exhaled something like permission. The rafters shifted, small pops like knuckles relieved after paperwork. I spread Father's letter flat on the table and set a cup on one corner, not to trap it, to give it a place that knows steam and elbows. Taza ran his palm over the threshold, reading the grain the way he reads trails. You'll need a latch, and that doesn't scare, he said. I'll make one from the broken rake. He didn't say when. Promises that hold don't chase clocks. I walked to the seep with a lantern, wanting to see our handprints before night carried them into general truth. The mud remembered us exactly. My ring finger left a deeper arc this time, like a person admitting she will keep choosing. 2 moths worried the light, and then decided darkness was better tasting. Behind me, the house stood where we put it, not pretending to be bigger than it is, not asking for parts of me I can't afford to donate. I came back to find Taza at the threshold with the carving unwrapped. He set it on the lintel, a small anchor with old breath in it. It belongs where hands touch leaving and returning, he said. Then debt stays closed each time. We stood, listening to the creak and to the soft noise the fire makes when it chooses not to become a lecture. Loneliness looked through the window, realized we had chairs for other guests, and moved along. "Ready?" I asked, and he nodded. We crossed into the doorway and stopped. Not vows, not claims, only agreement. We sat on the step with Stu between us and let the evening name us steady. The stars came on without asking whether we deserved them. A nightbird sang a 3-note pattern that sounded like the whistle he taught me. I whistled it back, soft. He smiled, softer. Houses inhale the first night they keep you dry. Ours did, again, as if practicing. The knot at the tether line lay clean and flat. The ledger in May's hand wore a fresh ribbon of truth, not Pike's kind. The cairn held its corner without bravado. Trust earned over time sat down and stretched its legs. Healing moved furniture. Resilience washed the bowls. Abandonment recognition slept on the porch. Quieter now, understanding it would not be invited in as often. I stood and looked in the window. The glass returned what it had. 2 people arranged at the edge of a room they were, building without pretending the room owed them anything. My mirror reflection did not flinch. His didn't either. The creek kept speaking. The cottonwood kept counting. The house kept breathing. In the window's reflection, I see 2 people not trying to be prettier than we are, only steadier. Light narrowed, then flared. We reached a spill of gravel that looked loose but held if you placed your heel where the rock had already forgiven someone else. "Wait here," Taza said, touching the angle with 2 knuckles. "Let the slope carry, not shove." I obliged, learning the small confession of letting ground be wiser than the body that fears it. When we climbed out onto an apron of slick rock, the wind found us like a friend with news. From there we could see the valley, and with it, my ranch spread like a page in the wrong man's hands. A rider shot from my barn, dust boiling behind like bad punctuation. Even at distance I knew the set of those shoulders and the way his hat brim tried too hard to look like authority. Ephraim. He rode as if the horse owed him breath, and the road owed him narrative. Taza lowered to a knee, sighting along the line of brush to learn where the posse's confidence would fail. "He left, hurried," he said. "He'll return slower, with people to say he is right." The truth of that hurt a splinter under the nail of the heart. We cut behind a shelf where sage kept its counsel, and Taza knelt to lay another cairn, the top stone a flake shaped like a tooth. "If the wind knocks this, we went south," he said. "If it holds, east." The conversation with future us continued. Practical as bread, we skirted a dry pour-off, then slipped into a rib of shadow that ran all the way to a stand of cottonwood. There, the air smelled of damp bark and a generosity I wanted to deserve. "We're nearing the north fence," I whispered, the one father set on bedrock. The word father carried more weight than I'd planned to haul. Taza heard it and did not flinch at the load. At a low bend, water had pooled again, fat with silt and patience. We crouched to drink. My reflection wavered a stranger and not the mirror the desert allowed. Taza pressed his palm in the slick beside mine. 2 handprints again side by side, not touching, anchoring us to this corridor of survival. The symbol steadied me more than any oath. It asked for nothing loud. It made no promise the weather couldn't honor. Emotional intimacy like that doesn't burn hot. It holds. We climbed the last ladder of stone to a lip that gazed toward my east pasture. The grass lay mashed in a wide turn near the lane, a circle written by riders who enjoy being watched by dust. "He staged a show," I said. Someone dreamed a rumor and rented horses. Taza pointed to the overlap of prints. 3 came in, 4 left. He picked up a partner. I tasted metal, the flavor of choices that pretend to be facts. Ledger at the mission buys time, Taza said, but your land will need more than paper. He wasn't warning. He was counting nails before the roof goes on. It needs us seen working on it, I said. Work is truth some men can't afford to lie about. He nodded. The wind lifted, turning the cottonwoods into a crowd, whispering a vote. We moved along the rim and dropped into a boulder garden where floods had played giants' games. Each step was agreement. You hold me. I honor you. I told Taza what father wrote in the margins of his maps, the ethics of a fence that isn't a wound. The mercy of leaving the oldest cottonwood outside your claim so birds can ignore men. The discipline of allowing rage to cool before you make a cut in ground or person. Taza listened as if the land were speaking through my mouth and he didn't want to be rude. When we reached the shadow of a sandstone fin, he touched the rock with his fingertips. A greeting, not a superstition, and the stone, in its way, agreed. We climbed to a low saddle that put the ranch house square in frame. My kitchen window flashed once sun on glass, or someone inside moving a pan like a mirror. Missed connection, I said, half to the wind. The house keeps trying to recognize me. Taza's eyes took in the roofline, the barn door ajar. The hitch rail dragged a foot as if a man had argued with a knot and lost. We don't walk into a room that calls strangers first, he said. We circle until it calls you. Sensible. Hard. The sun slid toward a fiercer tone. Shadows lengthened like sentences you wish you'd shortened. We crossed a dry pan, stepping where wind had brushed the sand into hard waves. Mule shoes, deep at the toe, sketched west toward the mission road. Ephraim again, or one of his hired consciences. A meadowlark stitched defiance into air. My ribs ached, not from the canyon this time, but from the measured practice of not wanting vengeance to swallow judgment. Forgiveness is not amnesia. It's a ledger that refuses forged credits. We reached a low rise at the pasture's edge. From there, the lane narrowed between greasewood and a pile of deadfall I'd meant to move last winter. The kind of choke point even amateurs choose for theater. We don't gift them a stage, Taza said. The canyon kept us. We keep the canyon. We turned back to the slot's mouth to descend and cut south under cover. I looked once more at the ranch I intended to keep without becoming the thing that stole it. A thin breath of smoke lifted from the rubbish pit, someone trying to erase a story they'd just written. Evidence, I said, or bait? Yes, Taza answered, and we moved, our shadows the right size again. At the canyon edge, he touched the cairn we'd left and rotated the top flake a quarter turn, the message to ourselves about wind and watchers. We dropped into cool and quiet, as if the day had exhaled us like a favor. The walls welcomed our smaller noises. My heartbeat quit pretending it was a drum. We took the bend with our shoulders and knees, old animals learning new doors. Halfway down, the canyon threw back a sound that didn't belong to us, metal against stone, then breath held and released through teeth not trained for patience. Taza lifted his hand. We slid into shadow where the wall overhangs by an arm's length and waited while the heat finished writing its sentence. I could feel my father's letter against my memory again, insisting on the old math. We leave what we can. We carry what we must. We do not pay with souls for soil. We reached the seep once more. Our earlier handprints had blurred at the edges, water doing its gentle edit. I placed my palm beside the ghost of mine. This time, I pressed harder, leaving the whorls deeper, a record fit for weather. Taza angled his hand beside mine again, still not touching, still saying everything that needed to be said for a first hour that had turned into several. The canyon seemed to nod. We had just started down the last ladder when a sound reached from the ridge, clean, sharp, and impatient. Not the flat crack of a kill. The short slap a man sends to move pieces on a board. The air quivered. A pebble skipped. A crow rose, insulted, and left. From the ridge comes a shot not to kill, to hurry. We built a camp where fear could see us and learn some manners. On a gravel bench tucked beneath a leaning juniper, we set the small fire low enough to honor the night and high enough to scold the chill. The canyon mouth lay a quarter-mile behind. The ranch glowed ahead like a story someone else kept trying to finish for me. Taza chose the spot for its sightlines and its silence. I chose it because the wind carried cottonwood scent when it remembered, and cottonwood means water remembering you back. We worked without ceremony. He cleared a ring. I fetched stones that had already learned to hold heat. He stacked kindling the way a careful hand stacks reasons. I sparked the tinder and watched it take the lesson without hissing. We said little because dusk is a poor time for speeches. When flame steadied, fear stepped close, saw we were busy, and sat down with better posture than usual. Dinner was dry meat softened in water and the memory of smoke. We chewed, like people who expect to be acquired again. Coyotes discussed the moon off to our left. An owl negotiated rates with the field. I rolled my shoulders until they remembered not to live in courtrooms. Taza sat with his back to a boulder, knees up, knife sheathed, attention unthinned. No big ones. They bruise easy this hour. My father wrote his in margins. I answered. He said ink survives mouths. I told Taza how the letters of truth outlived bad sermons and worse deals. How father's hand favored verbs that didn't swagger, keep, leave, respect, repair. He taught me offense should never be a wound, I said. He taught me to forgive men who tested me before they asked my name. I forget that lesson easily. The fire made a noise like agreement and kept to its work. My brother, Taza said after a while, the words arriving without drum roll, walked a road someone else drew. He didn't say where or when. He didn't decorate the grief with adverbs. He took the smallest pot. He made jokes for children who were thirsty. He held our mother's shoulder like wind holds a bird. One morning a wagon needed a voice more than a body, and he gave it. He looked into the space above the flames, not through it. Pain without spectacle, he said, and I understood I had been trusted with a single unpainted board. I set it on the sawhorses of my attention and didn't touch it again. We planned watches over embers that learned restraint. 2 hours each, he said. Wake me with a whistle, not your hand. He taught me a 3-note pattern a quail might use if it had opinions about survival. Soft, lower, lower, with a pause after the second to make room for any answer that might save both lives. I practiced under my breath until the sound belonged to the dark more than to my lips. He nodded, pleased with the math of it. I admitted the terror that follows me into sleep, the fear of becoming. Ephraim's story, of letting his version of me ungrateful, unstable, unfit, settle into the county like a permanent address. If the court writes me wrong, I worry I'll start reading myself that way, I said, saying it didn't feel like surrender. It felt like moving a loaded beam with 2 hands instead of 1. We right ourselves with what we stand near, Taza said. We stood near stone all day. That helps. The assurance landed harder than comfort because it had work to do. The sky turned the color of an unpolished knife. Stars came on shy, then confident. I walked the camp's edges, learning them with my soles as well as my eyes. He showed me where he'd strung the tether line horse looped low to a willow switch that would complain if anyone talked to it with steel. He hung a little bell from a hairline of cord that would whisper if wind pushed what it shouldn't. Sleep listens better when it knows the tools are awake, he said. and I felt how much of survival mood is simply engineering. We settled. I took first watch. The fire did that breathing thing flames do when they agree to behave. The juniper made our shadows into taller, kinder people who didn't need forgiveness as much as we did. Out beyond the bench, the ranch sighed the regular sigh of night animals negotiating with habit. My thoughts tried to creep toward old streetlights and mirror reflections and the way empty diners offer a seat to everyone except the thing you came to fix. I let the thoughts pass without offering a chair. I listened instead to pebbles ticking as they cooled, to an insect rehearsing courage, to my own pulse learning a slower song. Half an hour in, the wind shifted. Dust scuffed against something hollow, maybe a gourd, maybe a tin cup hanging wrong. I rose into a crouch and felt the wrapped knot at my wrist decide to keep its word. Hidden pain raised its head and asked if attention was a feast. I told it no, we're fasting. In the dark, Taza slept, as men do who trust their perimeter. Not heavy, not proud, only honest. The moon climbed a notch. A night bird practiced the second note of our whistle and bailed on the third. I smiled and kept time. When it was my hour to sleep, I lay down with my back to the warmed boulder and my face to the sky. I am not good at sleep when dignity has had to work late, but my body chose to believe the knot, the bell, the willow, the man. In that trust, emotional intimacy took a quiet seat and did not ask for attention. Dream came, trimmed with angles. Father folding maps at the kitchen table. The nurse at the clinic of a second chance, sliding a ledger and nodding without sermon. A small girl tracing a chalk door on a cracked sidewalk and testing the handle until it turned. I stepped through and the dream gave me light, then withdrew it like a test I might pass later. Taza's fingers touched my boot heel, not flesh. Just leather shifting weight the way dawn shifts color. My watch again. I rose, took the perimeter, tasted dew and ash and something like caution. Why my name? I almost asked as I passed him, because he had said it at the canyon mouth with a care that didn't belong to chance. He opened one eye, read the question on my face, and shut the eye again with the grace of a man who will not spend someone else's confession for warmth. The open loop lived, humming, but it no longer hurt to carry. Somewhere a rock slid under a nervous hoof. The horse didn't begin that noise. People did. I moved to the willow where the tether line ran from trunk to stake. The line was taut with useful promise. I checked the hitch, my hitch now. The one he'd made me practice until my fingers could tie it in bone cold or grief madness. The bell hung still. A small star waiting for work. I breathed into cupped hands and tasted smoke and night's thin sugar. The ranch lights yawned and closed. The horizon considered making a rumor of dawn and decided to be cruel a little longer. Taza, padded over with a canteen and a half-smile that has rescued more hours than I know. We shared a swallow because ritual keeps breath from spending itself on ghosts. When it's your name, I'll tell you, he said, not looking at me, not looking away, as if the dark needed to witness the contract. I accepted that as the only answer worth having tonight. I didn't need ownership. I needed sequence and a future. He returned to his boulder without adding weight to the ground. The fire leaned into coals, red promises under black patience. My eyes adjusted until the world was a field of outlines and intentions. The willow shivered once, then calmed. The horse shifted, then thought better of it. I heard a night mouse laugh at me for caring about lines. I laughed back in silence. Fear stayed where we had seated it and behaved like a guest whose host knows where to put the plates. Then the air changed in that way human malice teaches it to. It wasn't a gust. It was a decision, sound thinned, as if removing clutter before a knife enters cloth. The bell gave no warning. Bells tell you about movement, not intent. I felt it through my boot, first a whisper under leather, Steel speaking to fiber without wanting the sky involved. I dropped to my knees and slid my hand along the tether line. Smooth, then stutter, then smooth again, where a new edge had argued with old cord. The horse's head lifted. Breath snorted once, then trained itself to be useful. I lifted the line to my cheek and listened with skin. The sound returned, lazy but exact. A light sawing motion, patient as bad news that knows its hour. I reached for the whistle pattern in my mouth and found it ready. 3 notes lodged like tools in a well-kept shop. I was about to call Taza when the cord went slack in my hand as if it had sighed and decided to fall out of love with work. In the dark, a blade whispers our tether line sliced clean. When men assume you'll panic, calm becomes a weapon. The cut tether sagged in my hand like a sentence that had decided not to end, and the horse flinched once, then found me, eye rolling white, breath hot with someone else's impatience. I pressed the knot's free tail to my palm and let my voice be water. Taza moved first, no shout, no show, just a palm to the horse's cheek and a twist of wrist that sent the frightened head toward him, not away. Leather whispered. Steel hushed itself. Somewhere left. Gravel ticked under a boot that didn't believe in learning. The saboteur stepped from juniper shadow with his hat pulled low and a borrowed courage. He rattled the line with his knife hand and grinned for the dark. "Jump, damn you," he told my horse, which told me everything I needed about his knowledge of animals and people. Taza didn't reach for his blade. He reached for the man's certainty. A handful of dust lifted from his boot and took the man's eyes for half a blink. In that blink, Taza closed distance and rolled the knife wrist outward with an effort that felt like a suggestion, not a force. The blade fell obediently, point first into sand. I felt resilience align with my breathing, neat and useful. Hoofbeats skittered on the rim 2, maybe 3, then paused to let the world audition its fear. I picked up the fallen knife with my left hand and leveled the pistol with my right. The man heaved once against Taza's armbar, then quieted with a hiss. "Don't break him," I said, "because forgiveness is cheap at night and expensive in daylight. Just show him how to stand." Taza obliged, shifting weight until the man's bravado met the ground and learned to be modest. We could hear reins jingle. A night bird stuttered the note I'd practiced and stopped, undecided about courage. The next shadow carried a badge and a posture. Deputy Bram Yates slid down the slope like a man hoping gravity would disguise intention. His hand rested easy on his holster. His smile worked harder. "Evenin', Miss Hart," he said. "Reports of stolen stock ran your direction." He glanced at Taza kneeling the saboteur, then back to me with a look that asked to be called reasonable. I didn't oblige. "You brought a blade to my line," I said to the pinned man. "That's theft of breath." The man spit in sand to buy himself a second. Bram's eyes flicked to my pistol and lingered at my wrist wrap like it was a scandal. "No need for dramatics," he said. "Let's all step back." He planted his boots just inside our perimeter markers, the willow bend and 3-stone stack Taza had set, and pretended not to notice them. My gun followed his belt buckle, not his face, because men care about mirrors on their middles more than their mouths. Behind Bram, another rider's silhouette rocked, uncertain as a promise. The third horse snorted and crunched a pebble, impatient. "Ask your man why my horse is loose," I said, keeping breath level. "Ask him why his knife smells like hemp and not venison." Bram tilted his head, listening for the politics in my sentence, not the truth. He lifted 2 fingers to the rim easy, and the third horse stood down but didn't leave. "We've had reports," he tried again, "of impropriety, of strangers on ladies' land, of—" I felt the old heat crawl my spine. Abandonment recognition reached for its old chair. I kept it standing. He's not a stranger, I said. He's my ally. You're the one on my land after dark with men who cut rope. Taza loosened pressure on the saboteur without kindness and let the man taste his options. Don't, Bram said quickly, and it wasn't to me. He swallowed disappointment in the same motion. Let's call this a misunderstanding. The night carried a metallic clink from the ridge and brought it back thinner. Calm becomes a weapon when you refuse to make it interesting. I eased my hammer back without sound and set the bead on Bram's belt. One drag of trigger would shave the buckle and bruise his pride harder than his hip, and the desire glowed. Quick justice, neat lesson. Hidden pain begged for spectacle. Personal growth put a hand on its shoulder. I breathed out, found the edge of mercy, and kept it. You'll walk your men north, I said. You'll leave me my tether and my quiet. You'll remember that the mission's ledger has longer breath than your reports. Bram's jaw twitched at the word ledger. Power hates nouns it can't edit. 2 days. A voice hissed from the rim, the second rider, finally useful. Heard it myself. Bram ignored him badly. I didn't. 2 days for what? I asked. Silence tried to do me a favor and made a fool of itself. The pinned man took the deal before Bram could price it. Deed swap, he gasped. Private sale. Judge's office. Thursday. He gets the north field if you don't sign. He flicked his chin toward my ranch. Ephraim's riding a wide circle to make you chase something else. Taza's eyes met mine, steady as water that refuses to drown because it hasn't finished being a river. A shape detached from scrub on our left, hat in hand, hands wide, voice low. Don't shoot, Miss Hart. Nate Hollis, a ranch hand whose boss owed Ephraim money and didn't want to, climbed down slow. I told you, he said to Bram. I told you she don't spook. He turned his face to me. Heard the judge laughing. Said the mission ledger don't travel as fast as a cigar. Hollis's courage looked brand new and already scuffed. I wanted to wipe it clean and hand it back. We stood in a square of night that had learned manners. I lowered the pistol the distance it takes to mean I'm listening. 2 days, I said to Taza. He nodded. We walk the road that writes, he said. Trust is not a vow. It's a sequence. He stepped back from the saboteur and let the man stand. Bram's hand twitched toward his holster and froze when my pistol remembered its job. No arrests tonight, I said. No trophies. You want a story, deputy? Here's one. I slept, and I woke, and my horse was still tied. Tell it right. We packed the embers, water hissing a soft amen. The tether line got a new knot. Tighter, cleaner, tied by my fingers with Taza's patience on loan. Wind changed. The ranch sighed. Far beyond, a coyote called the moon by its first name and got away with it. Bram gathered his men with a jerk of jaw and a muttered, "We'll talk," which means nothing or too much, depending on who pays. Hollis lingered, hat twisting. "If you take Mission Road," he said, "ride the Arroyo bottom 2 miles, then cut through the dead cotton. Less eyes." He glanced once at Taza, not measuring him, just including him. Then he left, and his horse didn't look back. "Lead," Taza said to me, voice equal, not polite. "It's your ground." I took the front. He followed a half stride behind, not to shepherd, to mirror. Trust earned over time is a rope that holds without burning. We moved along the arroyo, hooves soft on the damp. The dead cottonwood loomed like a gate a giant forgot to close. As we passed under, a wind chime of dry twigs sang about past winters and men who thought they were bigger than flood. I remembered Father's maps and the way he drew boundaries with pencils instead of knives. We came up under the railroad cut where streetlights from town rocked the horizon with a tired halo. The track thrummed once with a freight crawling east, iron thinking about distance, boxcars at parade rest. It looked like the city again for a heartbeat, those diners with chrome counters, mirror reflections that lied with taste, penthouse empties, and their luxury cars like polished secrets. But the smell was creosote and sage, and my feet belonged to dirt that knows names. 2 days, I said again. Then we make them say it where paper can hear. Taza's answer was a sound you make when you agree with weather. Dawn blued the world. The mission's bell dozed and then remembered its shift. We reached the adobe wall with its hairline cracks like old grievances. Swallows looped like small questions answered by air. I dismounted and squared my shoulders against doorwood polished by other people's need. Taza stood at my left, not behind, not in front. The geometry of partnership. My hand lifted to knock, then paused because the latch lifted from inside without waiting to be asked. Otis Pike filled the doorway with hat and self-importance. His smile showed breadcrumbs of sleep and the desire to own morning. In his left hand he held a cylinder of paper bound by red string. He tapped it against his palm like a schoolmaster about to call roll. His eyes flicked to Taza, then back to me, calculating receipts. The air behind him smelled of ink and need. At last, he said, as if we were late to something generous. I took the liberty of drafting a clarification. He raised the roll so the string caught light like a fuse, just asking for fire. At the mission door, Otis Pike waits with a new deed rolled like a fuse. The judge's bench smelled like old ink and new fear. Paper stacked like polite threats beside a gavel that preferred gossip. Morning thinned through high windows and made dust look official. The pews creaked under bodies arranged by rumor. Ephraim took the front row with his preacher's jaw and cattleman's appetite, hat on his knee like an alibi. Pike stood a step behind with his red string fuse tucked under his arm, eyes shining with the joy of tidy crimes. Taza leaned against the back wall where shadows mind their business. Whispers counted him twice and liked the discount. Bram sat beside the aisle and practiced a neutral he hadn't earned. All rise, the bailiff mumbled, and we did, because standing marks the beginning of better sentences. Judge Whitlock's cousin, Judge Hal Whitlock in posture, if not blood, took his chair like a man unsure which side of truth pays better. He cleared his throat. The room pretended to be quiet. Ephraim rose in a sigh of cloth and said words he likes hearing. Safety, decency, confusion about boundaries. He did not look at me when he said confusion. He looked at the air where he imagined my outline should be corrected. He spoke of my improvised household with a tilt toward Taza that made Pew Wood want to splinter. He spoke of reputational concerns, ladling shame with a hand learned at potlucks that require signatures. When he said family, he meant property. When he said care, he meant custody. Pike followed with the bureaucrat's waltz, misplaced filings, provisional reconstructions, administrative advisories. He lifted the red string roll and smiled as if paper were a pet that had learned a trick. We merely seek clarity, he said, while his eyes asked the ledger to die of embarrassment. The string glowed against the white like a small fire that loves dry rooms. From the back pew, someone hissed Taza's name in a tone the county pretends it forgot. Taza didn't blink. He's practiced. We moved, not as fugitives, not as a pageant for luck, but as people who intend to reach a door before someone decides doors are a luxury. And in that movement our unspoken connection did its quiet arithmetic, his stride easing to meet the limits of my bruised breath, my eyes learning to find shadow where he would put a foot, his hand not touching my back, only shaping the air where balance tries to lie, which felt like emotional intimacy that refuses to call itself love because names too early make poor houses. Another pebble rattled from above. We sank to a crouch under a ledge that smelled like wet clay's memory of rain, And while we waited, my thoughts pulled me through rooms where justice was chrome and reflection, diners that returned my mirror reflection without mercy, street lights that offered safety without sleep, penthouse empties that framed luxury cars like polished lies, and a clinic of a second chance where a nurse slid me a ledger and said, "Write, then stay." And I wrote, then ran, which is a different sin than I thought. When the echo faded, Taza reached to the sand and sketched a thin line with his knife, our road to night, and tapped twice at the far end where he had put a dot, meaning the mission before dawn, the ledger that remembers dates better than judges do, the letter of truth my father signed with a hand that never learned to cheat stone. And in that small map lived all our bargaining. If we get there, ink might hold what breath cannot. And if we fail, ink will be the weapon used to make failure look proper. "Why did you know the canyon's safe line?" I asked, voice pitched low enough to pass for wind. Because he had turned us from the obvious descent at the last minute and used a seam of shale even the goats forget. And men who read land like scripture do not guess. He answered the way a seasoned beam answers weight, with a steady yes, and a story that did not demand credit. Once, seasons ago, he had walked this country behind. Elders who taught him where water pretends to hide, which shadows are loyal, which shelves hold if you ask with respect. And he had kept those lessons the way his people keep songs when governments prefer them forgotten, which is to say he kept them in his bones, where laws cannot edit. And if a stranger benefits today, then the road has paid him back for something it took. I wanted to ask more, but questions weigh the ankles when the sun begins to tilt. So we moved again, my breath finding a cadence that could afford tomorrow, his gaze cutting ahead to where the wash opened like a mouth that might bite. We hit the old wash at a slant and stepped into its cool throat, where the sun softened and sound learned to bend instead of boast. And there he taught me how to read tracks for the lies they love to tell, the scuff that looks hurried and is only careless, the deep bite that looks heavy and is just a man leaning courage into one foot, the print that looks alone and hides a second just inside the scrub. A lesson in resilience that feels like grammar, because once you hear land conjugate, you are less likely to fall for sermons about fate. Hoofbeats chimed the rim again, a tired metronome. We matched our silence to its tempo and turned when the wash told us to. And somewhere between shade and heat, my old emotional distance tried to recite its oath, which promises safety if you stay small. But my wrists remembered rope and said, "Not today." By late afternoon the sun learned a merciful angle, and the wind brought a rumor of mesquite smoke and kitchen work, the kind of smell that makes a body believe in houses again. And I realized how much I wanted a wall that knew my name without mangling it, a table where loneliness does not chair the meeting, and a ceiling that hears you breathe and does not take it for a confession, which is how personal growth sneaks up on a woman who thought she was only walking to save her land. We climbed a low shelf to check the horizon and found the first honest sign of the mission, the faint bell one valley over, metal talking to evening, and with that sound came a gust that brought forgiveness for mistakes I have been billing myself for. Because bells do that. They open a door you forgot you bricked. We reached the mission by dawn, Taza said, not as hope, as plan. And I nodded the way someone nods when the body has begun to argue in favor of staying, then immediately remembered Ephraim's way of saying my name with a quartz accent. The little sneer he curves into vowels when he tells men I am unstable and therefore unsuited to own anything except apologies, and the rage that pushed up at that memory had teeth. But Taza's silence kept it from biting indiscriminately. The horizon reddened at the edges. A horse coughed somewhere too close. We flattened behind a cholla and watched dust pour from the mouth of a side gully like someone shaking out a rug. Then settle with that offended dignity dust prefers, when men pretend to own it. Night negotiated its terms, the sky agreeing to stars if we agreed to move like people who know whistles. And we did. Our pace the pace that wins, not the pace that looks brave. As coyotes stitched gossip into the dark and the air cooled enough for thought to go elastic again. And in the stretch of that thought I returned to the question I had pocketed, softer now. Why had he known the safe line in my canyon? And why had he stepped in when men usually step out? And would the mission see him as my sin or my proof? And how do you carry a person into a room where your name has already been placed on the wrong ledger without allowing anyone to make a receipt of them? He did not answer what I did not ask, which is one way a person tells you they understand what a life is worth. We cut across a flat where mesquite had been spooked by lightning the year my father died. The branches kinked into question marks no clerk could smooth. And there, caught in a snag of thorn, fluttered a scrap of paper with ink washed to the color of old rain. Someone's invoice to someone else for something too dear to print. And I let it go because sometimes the world insists on metaphors, and sometimes you must insist on roads. Downwind, a single coyote yipped, then shut up, and Taza pointed with his chin toward a mesquite branch at the next bend, where something darker than bark had been burned into wood, a brand mark curved into letters by a man who liked his initials more than he liked truth. We eased close, and I saw what the fire had insisted the mesquite must hold. A name scorched in crooked confidence. My family name turned to Ash Scratch. My given name spelled the way Ephraim teaches men to misspell it when he is preparing their mouths to say mine in a courtroom. The mistake that looks like accident and is nothing of the kind. The private joke a coward leaves for night to admire. The wind pressed the branch until the burned edge sighed. A moth touched the black and reconsidered. My throat tasted copper, and in that breath between fury and action, I reached to the scarred wood and felt the heat long gone, and understood that tomorrow's fight had started yesterday without asking me to attend. A burned brand on a mesquite branch spells my name wrong on purpose. Some truths live in ink because men keep misplacing their mouths, and as the mission bell gave itself to morning, we walked through a courtyard that smelled like boiled coffee and lye soap and the kind of bread that forgives yesterday. My wrap sticky where the salve had done its work, my anger dry and useful like kindling stacked by a careful hand. And beside me, Taza carried his silence into a place that welcomes quiet when it heals and punishes it when it protects corruption, which meant we were safe as long as paper was braver than people. Swallows quilted the eaves. A broom whispered across stone. The cross over the chapel door looked tired of being asked to sign receipts it hadn't read. Sister May met us with that look she saves for lost livestock and lost intentions. Neither scold nor embrace. Only the sure knowledge of triage shaped into a woman who has outlasted winters and verdicts, and she said my name correctly, which is a sacrament in counties that hire men to misspell it. And she invited us into a room that had held births and deaths, and the lawyer's board nap, then closed the door with the finality that makes paper brave. And I stood there with my breath as wide as she told it to be while Taza stood near the window in a square of polite light and pretended the floorboards were better company than a nun's questions. Sit, she said. And I did. And she unwrapped my wrist with the same patience she gives to confessions that do not require God's signature. She cleaned the rope scars without asking what they meant, because meaning can wait until infection decides. And while she worked, she asked the housekeeping questions. When did you last eat? Can your ribs enjoy a cough without suing? How far can you walk before the world begins to tilt? And when I answered, she nodded without wasting pity on a woman who already knows how to live and would prefer supplies. The window's light brightened once as if considering God, then flattened when it saw who else had been invited, because the mission has learned that Grace must negotiate with clerks or else go broke. Outside, a church bell argued with a hammer. Inside, paper shuffled somewhere down the hall with the prim confidence of a man about to misplace something on purpose. "Ledger," I said, and May smiled like a person who has already polished a key, and she disappeared into the archive room where the walls smell of starch and ink and other people's mistakes, returning with a book that had outlived 3 pastors and 5 chairmen, and which she set on the table with the weight of a verdict nobody could afford to ignore, then opened with hands that did not tremble because she does not give tremors to rooms that have already stolen enough. The paper hissed softly, the spine complained, and there, tucked between pages that remembered a flood and a famine, lay my father's deed line, date stacked in neat figures, boundary named the way Earth prefers, witness scrawled by 2 men who died with their mouths honest and their pockets lighter than they needed to be. I ran my finger beneath the date, the way a blind woman announces a horizon to herself, and felt the ledger's cool leave a stripe across my skin, and in that stripe lived forgiveness for a year. I lost to anger and resilience for a day. I intend to steal back from men who buy sorrow wholesale and sell it retail with a flourish. Footsteps moved in the hall. The door clicked the way a throat clears when it wants attention, and in came Clerk Otis Pike, with a face shaped by starch and appetite, holding his hat in both hands like a man who doubts his head without it, and he smiled in that learned rural way that says, "I do not mean harm," while his eyes inventoried what might be profitable. "Misplaced," he said, before I asked, and reconstruction, and impropriety, all in a paragraph so smooth it might have been printed by a good press, and he let his gaze slide from my wrist wrap to Taza's shoulders and back to the ledger, as if all 3 were notes in a tune he intended to hum later for other men, and I felt the old hidden pain rise to meet him with a speech, the kind that wins applause in rooms that prefer theater to evidence, and I told it to stand down because May's hands were steadier than my fever, and ink was older than his training. Taza shifted his weight once, not in threat, in refusal to translate himself to satisfy anyone's curiosity, and the light at the window chose him for a second and then chose the ledger instead, wisely. "You have the wrong room for that word," May said when he mouthed impropriety, and she turned the ledger so the line faced him with its date and witness, and the margin note the last priest had scrawled when the flood forced everyone to remember they were neighbors, and she tapped that note with one clean fingernail and waited, and Pike's smile found its limitations and settled for being a mouth, and he allowed that the mission's secondary record had a way of surviving courthouse mishaps, and he thought perhaps the county might accept this as corroboration, provided we kept our voices pleasantly low for the sake of all involved, especially given the sensitivities regarding my choice of escort. "Escort," I said, as if the word were a pebble that needed spitting, and Taza's jaw did nothing while the skin under it remembered the road, and I chose to speak for myself and not for him, because men like Pike prefer women to borrow a man's dignity and then pay interest, whereas I prefer to spend my own and tip the person who kept the book. "He is not my escort," I said. "He is the reason my wrists are not rotting," and May closed the ledger with a small maternal thud that made the room agree, and out in the courtyard a broom paused as if to listen for whether this county might finally want a new song. Deputy Bram Yates arrived in the doorway with that careful lean men practice when they intend to look reasonable while selling you what reason refuses to bless, and his hat brim shadowed the polite ambition in his eyes, and he addressed Pike first, because that is how deals remember their parents, and he asked, in a voice that could pass for fairness if you were tired enough, whether we might prefer the ease of a private sale before week's end to prevent hard feelings about boundaries and ladies' reputations, and he let the last word rest in the air like a fly on butter, and waited for someone to swat it so he could be offended. Taza looked at the window again. May looked at the cross. I looked at the ledger and felt it breathe. Hard feelings are cheaper than stolen land, I said. And Bram smiled at the floorboards and said the county dislikes scenes, which is code for the county dislikes women who own a scene. And he tipped his hat to Taza without making the muscle in his jaw obey. And in his mouth Taza became the gentleman, which is the word a man uses when he has learned not to say the slur in front of the nun. By week's end, he repeated, a resolution. And the wind at the window went hot and then cold as if the world had inhaled on a coal and decided not to keep it. We moved to the chapel for a minute because rooms steeped in longer vows can slow a deputy's enthusiasm for theatrics, and in that dim, the candles exhaled beeswax and old music, and the podium's scar carried the history of sermons that told men not to steal, and men who took notes anyway, and I stood with my hand on a pew back that had learned to curve around grief, and let the emotional distance I had used for years dissolve into emotional intimacy with wood that did not argue, and I promised quietly that if the ledger saved me today, I would not squander that salvation on revenge when justice would do. A child darted through the doorway with chalk on his fingers, leaving a smudge that looked like a chalk door on the baseboard, and I smiled because doors do not require permission to be imagined, only hinges. When we returned to May's room, she reopened the book and wrote a copy by hand with the precision that starves judges of loopholes, and Pike asked, very gently, for custody of the original for safety. And May looked at him as if he had asked to borrow her ribs and said no without syllables, and he allowed as how the county respects the mission's autonomy, and I watched his throat swallow the word respect like medicine he did not enjoy. Through the open window a gust shouldered the curtain and brought with it a smell that did not belong to interior dialogue smoke with no kitchen in it. The flat, hungry smoke that wants hills and fences, and excuses. Bram frowned as if fire were unprofessional. May stepped to the window and lifted the sash. A drift of gray chaffed her sleeve and left a smear, and out beyond the mission's garden we saw a thin column rising on the upwind flank, where scrub stacks itself like tinder and waits for men with opinions to flick ash. And the sound that followed was not crackle yet, not roar, only the low throat clearing of a brush fire testing how much of the day still wanted to be dry. I felt my chest tighten as if someone had rewrapped the rope. Taza had already moved to the door to measure wind and route, and the number of hands we would need if the line turned. May set the ledger down to close the window against flecks that wanted to colonize paper, and when her palm lifted, the page wore a gray fingerprint nobody in this room had earned, a smear across my father's date like an insult from weather, and Pike, whose nature is to find advantage in accident, began to suggest evacuation paths that involved a detour by the courthouse, where documents enjoy cooler conditions, and Bram added that smoke makes people rash and that perhaps a quick signature could save many, and I saw how quickly disaster becomes currency in rooms that sell law. The bell began again, faster, not for prayer this time, for buckets. May's lips flattened, then lifted at one corner as if decision had muscle, and she slid the ledger into a canvas wrap and tied it with a knot that looked like the one Taza had used on my wrist, a knot that honors storms by refusing to brag. And she handed me the parcel and said, "You carry it. You asked for it. You will keep it." And I nodded until my neck understood ownership, and Taza nodded once without being asked, because he understands how weight travels through structures people intend to stand. Outside, gardeners ran for the pump handle. The sky practiced a darker vowel. The courtyard filled with the bustle of people who have lifted together before. And remember how. Pike backed toward the door with the smile that gets men into wagons. Bram tipped his hat at nobody. The curtains pushed in and then out like lungs trying to decide how much of this county to keep. And I took one last look at the line where my name lives without insult, and then looked at the smear that wanted to move in, and I felt a strange calm, because forgiveness sometimes begins as steadiness in a room that cannot afford panic, and steadiness is loud when everyone else chooses clatter. May said, "Go," in the tone nurses use on babies and judges, and we went. Ledger between my arms like a child that needed air. May sets the ledger down, pages smear with fresh ash. Brush fire kicking up wind. He taught me where stone remembers your weight and where it will throw you. In the slot canyon the world narrowed to shoulder-width truth, the kind that won't flatter a misstep. Taza went first, reading the sandstone for old water's handwriting, palm grazing the wall for temperature shifts that meant hidden ledges, eyes on the faint powder where lizards had rehearsed survival. I mirrored his pace, learning the cadence that keeps ankles from becoming sermons. Wind was a rumor above us. Below, the canyon kept its secrets in a hush that felt like duty. He stacked small cairns at each blind curve 3 stones, never 4 his quiet alphabet for return. I answered by placing a 4th pebble astride beyond, our dialogue laid in rock instead of noise. "Here the stone forgives," he said once, tapping a honeyed swale that cupped a boot like a patient hand. "There it remembers," he warned, pointing to a crust of sand that looked innocent until you noticed the hairline crack beneath. Memory throws. The lesson landed where rope scars still throbbed. I placed my foot where he had just lifted his and felt resilience rise from the bones outward. A steadiness, not borrowed from pride. We moved as shadows. Above, hoofbeats crossed the mouth of the canyon and faded, then returned with that false confidence men wear when they assume the ground loves them. Taza raised 2 fingers. "Listen," then a low sweep. "Wait." The air cooled. Our breath stopped trying to prove anything. In the squeeze of that silence, my father's letter of truth rustled inside memory. He had written about land like it could be deceived but would never lie, about not forcing fences into water's old rooms, about standing a boundary on stone older than any courthouse, and about choosing forgiveness, because rage spends breath too quickly when you are trying to outwalk men who don't tire. We emerged into a chamber where the canyon widened just enough for light to practice generosity. A trickle ran through, clear as a confession that intends to hold. We knelt to drink, and mud welcomed our knees without judging how we arrived. "This is a seep," Taza said, "where the rock remembers rain." I touched the water as if it might recognize my hand from a better story. Our 2 prints, his larger, mine stubborn, glossed side by side in the pool's edge, not touching, not claiming, but declaring a fact the day had not yet priced. 2 lives pausing in the same sentence, neither trying to become the other's period. Up canyon, a pebble pinged, then fell quiet. We listened to the silence for edges. "They'll overrun themselves before they find us," Taza said. "Canyon teaches or punishes, depends on posture." My posture had been argument for years against rooms that misnamed me, against mirrors that returned a picture of compliance. Here, stone asked for accuracy instead. I gave it, step by step, and felt the quiet transformation of breath that doesn't need to lie. We moved on, shoulders brushing the cool where flood once sang, and my mind dragged me back to ranch mornings when coffee smelled like patience, and my father's boots made that honest floor sound. He would pour half his cup into a saucer for the dog, then unfold maps that were more weather than paper. "We borrow land," he'd say. "We don't conquer it. We keep accounts with wind and creek and stone." Ephraim called that weakness and smiled for men who praised the smile. When he said family, the word meant deed. When he said virtue, the word meant witness who owed him. He had tutored me into abandonment recognition. The prayer said into a locked pantry, be small, be acceptable, be gone. Sister May stood, cowl stubborn, ledger under her arm like a child who knows whose house she belongs to. The room arranged itself around her out of habit. She set the mission book on the rail and turned the page to my father's line with a finger that has delivered better babies than this court can imagine. Date, she said. Witness. Boundary as surveyed by stone and water, not fashion. She did not scold. She laid facts like loaves. Miss Hart, the judge said to me finally, as if he had discovered the reason for his furniture. I stepped to the rail. The grain had bite, the edge remembered other hands. Speak. One word, and it was almost enough. I told them in the first person because no one else earns that pronoun for me. I said I intend to live, build, and choose help without paying toll in shame. I said my father taught fences not to wound and papers not to lie. I said vulnerability is not a verdict, resilience not a misdemeanor, and unspoken connection not a sin the county needs to tax. I kept voice low. I kept nouns heavy. Whispers pricked at Taza's shoulders like beggars who've lost their hats. He absorbed them without shrinking. He does not audition for any man's comfort. I didn't speak for him. I spoke where my name lives and sleeps. He walked me from a rope into shade. I said, you can call that indecency if your dictionaries need new pages. A few pews hunched and then unhunched. The judge didn't write that down. May's ledger already had. Pike coughed into his glove and unfurled the red string scroll like fireworks in a church. Boundary clarification, he announced, and the term slithered past the rails. On the page, the river bent conveniently away from Ephraim's cattle fence and toward my north pasture, as if water suddenly preferred to be a gentleman. My name sat on the top line, spelled right enough to pass at a glance and wrong enough to bleed under oath. The string twitched like it missed being. Fire. May tapped the ledger again. Secondary record, she said. Older than his red ribbon and twice as useful. She angled the book so light chose the ink. My father's date stared the room down. The margin note about the last flood told on men who relocate rivers by pencil. The school teacher in row 3 cleared her throat and raised a sheet of onion skin with rubbings of the original map. Children trace this bend for their lessons, she said. They're not wrong. The judge considered being moved and settled for embarrassed. Ephraim smiled anyway. That smile was the open loop I could not close. It said he'd already bought something I wasn't invited to appraise. It said clocks are for other people. He folded his hands as if to pray and studied my face the way a butcher studies scale. We only want peace, he said. Peace that looks like my house empty and his pasture larger. The judge hedged. Given the, sensitivities, he said, we'll take more clarifications. He looked at Bram for the shape of his neutrality, then at Pike for the next excuse. Delayed rulings are how small men buy bigger chairs. May closed the ledger with that maternal thud that says babies sleep, not justice. Dust swam in a beam and tried to be relevant. Outside, the bell took a breath and declined to ring. We stepped into the heat. The hallway carried broom smell and last week's arguments. Bram leaned on the jamb like he'd grown there and tipped his hat directly at me for the first time. Ruling soon, he said. Best to be flexible. I bend, I said, for wind and water, not for scissors. He let me pass, but his eyes asked if I needed a witness to my exit such that the story would read kinder later. I did not. In the courtyard, an old man mended a harness and pretended not to listen. A child chalked a door on the base of the wall and drew 2 handles just in case one stuck. Taza stood in the shade, not quite touching the adobe, and watched the dust settle where it chose. He smiled, I said. He bought something. He bought noise, Taza answered. It spends fast. Hollis drifted near like a rumor that wants to be accurate. Thursday, he murmured. Judge's back office. Ephraim's pastor bringing a witness who remembers what he's told. We rode home slow because speed writes in a hand, juries distrust. The road carried heat and the smell of dry cattle, the low music of a windmill that needed oil, the iron tang of railroad sweat. My body counted aches. My mind counted doors. Survival mood paced, then sat quietly when it realized the day wasn't asking for heroics, just competence. I hate rooms where I'm spoken about, I said finally. Then we make rooms where you're the only person sized to your name, Taza said. Not comfort, architecture. Our gate stood the way we left it. Rope latch snug, willow twist right. Birds insisted on their own gossip near the eaves. I dismounted with a calf's careful knees and felt every choice my father taught my bones. The porch held its afternoon shadow, long and honest. I put my hand to the door plank, already rehearsing the good weight of the letter of truth tucked where it belongs. The latch lifted with no resistance. The door opened on air that had learned a stranger and tried to pretend it hadn't. Floorboards remembered 2 extra steps since morning, one heavy, one careful. The table stayed where I set it. The chair moved a thumb's breadth, an insult only housekeepers and women who noticed danger would measure. The tin cup on the counter wore a new fingerprint. My skin went cold where the sun still warmed it. We crossed the threshold together. The room did not argue. I walked straight to the cedar box where I keep what breath can't lose. The lid raised on a hinge that did not squeal, which told me oil had been here before me. The cloth lay folded like a good thought. The space beneath it was as tidy as a lie. My father's letter was gone. Behind me, a floorboard sighed under nobody. The wind tested the window and found it willing. Far away, the mission bell woke up late and tried to help. I stood with my hands on the empty air where ink used to live and felt loneliness knock. I didn't open. I felt resilience move furniture and told it yes. Taza stood at my right shoulder where bad stories cannot climb. He didn't touch me. He made the room choose a side. Ruling delayed. When we return to my ranch house, the door is open and the letter is gone. Theft would have been kinder. Rearranging truth leaves fewer fingerprints and more ghosts with opinions. The cedar box was neat. The cloth folded right. The space beneath politely empty. A copy lay on the table, wrong date, wrong bend in the river, right ink smell. A floorboard sighed behind nobody, and dust hung midair like a thought reconsidering itself. The room had been handled by someone who believes order is a weapon. Chairs squared to the table. The cup turned so the dent faced the wall. Even the window latch wore oil that did not come from my routine. Abandonment recognition knocked softly. I told it to wait on the porch and listen. Taza walked the perimeter without touching anything a second time. He watched light for interruptions, then looked under the rug for ownership prints. Nothing stolen, he said, except your ground made into paper. His calm sharpened mine. A far bell tried to ring and remembered smoke. The sound arrived bent and worried. The copy's mistakes were precise, like a clerk's good suit worn for bad errands. My name was right enough to fool a glance and wrong enough to bleed under oath. The river kinked away from bedrock and toward Ephraim's appetite for fences. A fly landed on the margin note and washed its hands like a judge. Your father's letter wasn't a map, Taza said. It was weather with handwriting. He traced the blank space where it should be, then watched, my face quietly. I saw him once, he added, voice low, as if speaking to the wood, trading tools by the river. He filed a plane until Steele remembered humility. The room tilted, then agreed to stand still if I did. "You met him," I said. Not a question, not a door swung wide. "He didn't know my name," Taza answered, "but I knew his way with stone." He nodded toward my wrist, wrap knot flat, humble, sure recognition traveling between work and worker. Hoofbeats stitched the road outside, casual as gossip with a knife under it. We waited until silence arranged itself back where it belonged. He looked at fences like they were verbs. Taza continued, "Not trophies. I recognized your steps by that memory, and your breath by its patience." Loneliness tried to make a speech about years spent under streetlights and chrome diners. It lifted photos of penthouse empties and quiet luxury cars humming in garages. I let it hold those pictures, then set them down beside the rope scars. Resilience turned a chair for me and nodded at the door with humor. "Where would the real letter go?" I asked. "If not the courthouse, where someone thinks paper should nap until needed," he said. "Back room, store side, Pike's Roost," I answered, and the name tasted like starch and small accounting. We left the house closed but awake. The hinges knew better than to complain. Streetlights smeared the evening. Town leaned into itself like a tired horse. We tied our horses behind May's kitchen and walked the alley like a sentence. The general store wore lamplight and a smile that forgot to touch its eyes. A cricket rehearsed survival near the barrels. Dust rose and decided not to travel. The counter bell had been trained to sound hopeful. It rang like weak tea. Otis Pike looked up from a ledger that wanted to be left alone. He arranged his mouth into sympathy and his eyes into counting machines. "Back, already," he said, as if the day had invited us to supper. "I need the parcel misdelivered 2 months ago," I said without decorations. "The one addressed to me, held for pastor's review, never reaching my hands." Pike frowned thoughtfully, the way men frown when their pockets talk louder. "So many parcels," he murmured, filing my urgency into the wrong drawer again. Hollis drifted in with an empty sack and a full conscience. "Check the pigeonholes behind flour," he said, not looking at anyone's face. Pike sighed like a curtain and reached for his keys with exaggerated virtue. The back room smelled of rope, molasses, and secrets that shared blankets. We passed crates, stamped with towns that liked their names written big. A calendar girl stared from June and asked us to hurry without judgment. Pigeonholes climbed the wall like beehives waiting for winter stories. 3rd row down, left side. My name written twice, once properly, once edited. Pike slid the parcel onto a table as if he were building trust. The string remembered being tied by a hand I would know blind. He started to speak. Taza's silence held up a palm, and words reconsidered themselves. "Open it," Pike said, suddenly generous. He loved witnesses when he chose them. Paper breathed the way old linen does when it forgives you for arriving late. My father's hand filled the page with verbs that didn't need applause. Keep, leave, respect, repair. "A fence should oblige water, to be honest," he wrote. "Stone cairn at the North Field holds the true corner when men forget." The letter did not scold. It absolved the hour I had wasted hating. "Forgive," he wrote, "without surrendering, or you will trade land for fewer nights. Leave the oldest cottonwood outside your claim. It remembers small hunger well. Trust the creek's winter bend. It refuses to lie for summer." A noise from the alley tapped the door bucket against a broken step. We paused, listening to the night arrange itself into manageable pieces. Pike fussed with a pencil as if sharpening were a moral act. "Copy stays here," he said. "Original goes where Sister May keeps spines." I read the last lines twice, letting their weight stack on my ribs gently. "Your name is yours," Father wrote. not the county's rehearsal of it. Write it on wood that forgives knives, and in ink that survives fashion. Bring home the boundary the river already wrote, not the one for sale. The room felt larger. My lungs decided to live 2 sizes bigger. Forgiveness parked its cart out back and brought tools rather than songs. Personal growth stood in the doorway and asked whether we were serious this time. We are, I thought, and felt the knot at my wrist answer yes. Taza set the letter back in its wrap with a tenderness that avoided theater. He looked at Pike without heat, which is a rarer insult than shouting. Lock the front, he said. You will be burgled by oversight if you don't. Pike almost smiled, then remembered his salary, and nodded like a man learning. We stepped into the lane where streetlights smeared gold across cracked sidewalks. A child had drawn a chalk door beside the post, handles bright as bravery. He had opened it halfway and stopped, as if waiting for permission. I traced the outline with my boot and felt the world prefer hinges. Wind pushed ash under the lamps and made halos look guilty. May's bell tried to ring and failed politely. Smoke has strong hands. On the horizon, a low orange seam stitched itself into the dark. The seam thickened. The air tasted like pennies and apology. We have to move stock, I said, and cut a break before dawn. Canyon will help if we ask it right, Taza answered, already mapping. A gust shouldered the elm and made it hiss like a kettle caught late. Somewhere a rooster argued with clockwork and lost, which felt appropriate. The square, the courthouse windows blinked like tired men faking penance. Bram stood in shadow at the corner, hat low, trying to look smaller. Judge wants you tonight, he said. After you finish the thing with flames. His voice failed at casual. Fear had rearranged its furniture inside him. What changed? I asked, not slowing because smoke rarely negotiates with tempo. Paper, he said, and a pastor who remembers too much with help. He glanced at Taza once, then twice, like a man forgiving the mirror reluctantly. Go, he added. If the wind turns, you have an hour, maybe less. The wind turned while he spoke, because wind enjoys irony when men posture. Ash drifted across my palm and wrote nothing worth keeping without consent. We ran for the horses, letter pressed inside my vest like a kept vow. The street behind us learned to flicker. The bell remembered breath and rang hard. Map it from above, Taza said as we rode. Voices shredded by speed. Stone lines, old cattle paths, the dry wash that becomes a tool at night. I pictured the cairn my father built and the fence he refused to sharpen. Fire knows trails too, and it loves shortcuts that men gift it. We reached the last rise before the ranch and saw the canyon inhale. Flame licked the low grass and considered fences with hungry theology. The wash that saved us at noon prepared to betray us at midnight. Wind leaned its shoulder against the canyon mouth and promised to push. He reined in, eyes reading smoke like water. I felt the hour shrink. Cut here, he said. Turn them there. Stack stone where fire prefers speed. The sky threw a coal across our faces and called it a star badly. The canyon lowered its voice, then lifted it, then chose shouting for efficiency. Wind shifts. Brush fire turns. Canyon becomes a chimney. We have 1 hour. Fire knows only forward. People must choose. We chose speed, and then we chose accuracy. Taza split the night, with tasks, not speeches, and the ranch learned to obey. I rode for the lower gate and drove cattle toward the stone-lined bend. He sprinted the ridge, carving a firebreak with his shovel where grass bragged loudest. Sparks leapt the lane like boys testing fences after sermons. We slapped them down with wet burlap and names we didn't need later. The ditch behind the barn drank our buckets and argued for more. Survival mood took the wheel, refusing panic permission to touch the horn. Hollis arrived first, with 2 teenagers and a mule both proud and tired. He didn't ask permission. He looked for the worst and started stopping it. Mrs. Kincaid trundled in with a washtub like it was a badge. Water sloshed and hissed secrets onto the grass until the secrets quit. We cut brush where fire loved sprinting and left green where it stumbled. Taza laid a line of stones along the contour like stern handwriting. "Speed here," he said. "Funnel there. Let the creek become an old policeman." His calm directed our hands. Resilience borrowed bones from his tone and filled us. Hoofbeats carried more neighbors, some debtors to Ephraim and some to silence. People who had practiced looking away learned how to aim buckets honestly. The air thickened with ash and the humility of sweat making decent decisions. We coughed like sinners and worked like people who prefer tomorrow paid in cash. A gust rolled fire against the north fence with a drunk's confidence. Flame licked cedar posts, then leapt toward dry cheatgrass like ambition. I shouted for the yearlings and slapped the gate panel with a rope. They moved wrong first, then remembered older migratory maps and moved right. Hollis slipped on the slope, ankle turning under him with ugly intent. His hands pinwheeled. The mule brayed. A bucket flew and became steam. I caught Hollis by the belt and shirt, felt his ribs swear against mine. He dangled over the wash, boots flailing, hat gone to better stories. "Got you," I said, letting my voice carry steel and a little kindness. He looked surprised at being held by someone he had half expected to fail. We dragged him back and his breath argued, then agreed with our plan. "Mercy," he managed, instead of victory. He laughed once and coughed twice. That laugh moved the crowd better than any sermon I could write. Shoulders squared. A boy stopped being cool and started being strong. Mrs. Kincaid swore nearly holy and fetched more water with a grin. Community recalibrated in real time, as if fire corrected our posture. Taza signaled from the ridge with a shovel held like a flag. 2 arms wide meant break. The circle above his head meant drive. We widened the line where Sparks had enjoyed rehearsing suspicion. A small whirl lifted ash and set it down without being dramatic. The creek received ember seeds and turned them into unmarketable stories. We dragged soggy sacks across hot earth and listened for fresh whispers. Hidden pain asked me to sit. I asked it to fetch instead. We met in the middle and kept walking because deals outrun grief tonight. I smelled the chapel's beeswax drifting in from town and knew the bell's mood. Judge Whitlock's cousin would be polishing spectacles and practicing neutral eyebrows. Deputy Bram would be choosing which words hurt least and worked most. The bench would want our bodies tidy and our names ready for sale. We steered the last bunch across Taza's stone line and into safer dust. The wind grudged us that win, then remembered cruelty and shifted again. Canyon mouths love to be chimneys when men forget old stories about them. Flame dropped into the wash, decided it liked the view, and tried climbing. "Now!" Taza shouted, and we pulled the last fence panel with older anger. 4 hands, 1 rope, 2 posts. Joined labor became a hinge the wind respected. The panel fell. Fire raced toward nothing worth bragging to. A sudden hush took the edge off the night and invited breath to return. We didn't rest. Embers pretend to sleep like cats planning theft. We walked the line stamping and wetting, like prayers. A calf bawled toward a blackness we couldn't allow to be permanent. Hollis limped into the dark and brought it home with jokes for courage. For a moment, the sky could afford stars. Then it reconsidered responsibility. Lightning flared far off, then sniffed at scrub and changed its mind. Thunder made a promise none of us believed without receipts. I thought of the clinic of a second chance and its calm iodine breath. Forgiveness tapped my shoulder, not for fire, for neighbors who learned late. I nodded and lifted another bucket because practicality makes better liturgy. Taza gave me the smallest grin, a currency accepted by tired spines.